Good morning, everybody. This is great because I love analyzing data, I love talking about it, and I also am a morning person. So I hope you're all ready for what's about to occur. And also, remember I said yesterday's talk about the SIR was a bit of a warm-up. So we're going to be spending a lot of time this morning talking about the SIR. So I hope you're well rested and ready for that. So this morning, we don't really need to talk so much about the introductory analysis stuff like we did yesterday. So we're going to really just get right into it. I will demonstrate how you could use frequency tables for event level data. We talked about it a little bit yesterday. We'll talk about it a little bit more this morning. We'll also describe and interpret the SIR for SSIs and LabID events using a couple of real-world scenarios. We'll also discuss the importance of precision and practical significance. And so that piece will actually come towards the end of today, and that will touch a little bit on device-associated infections as well. So we're not going to be 100% doing SSI and LabID today. And I'll also illustrate the use of internal comparisons. All right, so let's get into this. Our first example, let's say your facility has completed reporting of LabID data for 2013, and at this moment you're specifically interested in looking at your facility's CDI LabID data for the second half of 2013. So we're looking at July through December. And so you decide to start with the SIR because for those acute care hospitals participating in CMS's quality reporting program, you know that the SIRs are used for that measure. So LabID SIRs are available for both CDI and MRSA bacteremia for acute care hospitals only at this point in time. We do have the MDRO CDI module output options folder. Remember, we organized that by module first. And when we open that up, we have folders for each of the LabID types. So you'd want to go to the MRSA LabID events or the C. diff LabID events, and the SIR options are at the bottom of the screen. And of course, we also have these options available for CMS-related reporting. I think this is a good point to mention something that I forgot to mention yesterday, and my colleague reminded me about this. Within NHSN, the SIRs, if you are a facility, are going to be produced for your individual facility or hospital. However, we do know that there are quite a few hospitals that are reporting data under a CCN that includes multiple hospitals. So if you're part of a healthcare system, you may be sharing a CCN with 2 or 3 other hospitals, and the data that are actually displayed on Hospital Compare are by CCN, not NHSN facility ID. So I just want to bring that up because if you are one of those hospitals that share a CMS number with another hospital, that what you get out of NHSN will be for your individual entity and not the CCN group as a whole, okay? All right, so for both of the MRSA and CDI LabID SIRs, we calculate the number expected at a facility quarter level, and that's actually a calendar year quarter, using something called negative binomial regression. And I'll demonstrate to you what that actually is in a moment. But we get the question a lot, why quarterly? Why is this being done on a quarterly basis? Because as you probably are familiar with, you can get COUTI SIRs, SSI SIRs, you can actually produce those at the monthly level. But for C. diff and MRSA, the lowest you can go is quarterly, but then you can go up to half year or year. But why do we do this quarterly? Well, when we were analyzing the baseline data at CDC, we noticed that there was quite a bit of variability in prevalence rate. We use prevalence rate as a risk factor, which you'll see in a moment. And there was a lot of variability from month to month, and we needed to find a way to kind of alleviate that variability. And so what we decided to do was we use quarterly level prevalence rates, and that actually provided a better prediction of LabID healthcare facility onset events. And so because of this, we only allow you to get down to a quarterly level to actually produce an SIR. Also, these are available for overall inpatient facility-wide or FAC-wide-in surveillance only. Why is that? Well, for one, we were tasked with developing a measure for the CMS Hospital Inpatient Quality Reporting Program, as well as for the HHS Action Plan to prevent HAIs. And we needed to focus on MRSA, bacteremia, and C. diff at first, because we had to make sure that we had that measure in on time. But in addition, the FAC-wide-in surveillance data for these two organisms had the most sufficient data with which we could risk adjust at a national level. So, you know, this goes back to kind of what I said yesterday when we talked about VAE data and some newer events, is that we need to make sure at a national level that we have enough volume with which we can feel comfortable actually producing some risk-adjusted measurement or some baseline data for you to use, especially in the face of public reporting. And so that's why we were focused on these specific types of LabID events for this specific type of surveillance method. Angela had this in her slides yesterday. We do have the description of the risk adjustment methods that we use for LabID. It is on our website. I have the link here, the direct URL at the bottom, but if you go to our NHSN website and go to the, I think it's the data and statistics page or the data reports page, all of our annual reports are listed there, as well as the risk adjustment methods for C. diff and MRSA. All right, so I did mention that we calculate the number of expected for LabID events by using something called negative binomial regression. So this is what the risk model looks like. I am warming you up a little bit more before we get to the SSI. And what we have here are, we have some betas and we have some X's. The betas indicate that that is the parameter estimate. So that is a number that we plug in there that comes out of the risk modeling that we perform. I'll show you what that looks like. And the X is the presence of a risk factor, okay? And we match these all up, and then we do use patient days as a multiplier when we come up with this number expected for LabID. The baseline data for LabID events is 2010 to 2011. We had to use 2 years combined, again, to make sure that we had a sufficient amount of data with which we could risk adjust. So this is pulled out of that risk adjustment paper. This is a table showing you the risk factors used for C. diff LabID SIRs, all right? So the parameter estimates are here. Remember, I mentioned that beta is a parameter estimate. It will be a number. This is what is produced out of our risk modeling at CDC. And so we use this to multiply by the presence of a risk factor. So we have a few different factors here. We do use CDI Test Type. We use community onset admission prevalence rate. And what I want to bring up here is that for C. diff, we do not use the co-HICFA events, okay? It is limited to only community onset events in this prevalence rate. We also use the facility bed size and medical school affiliation. Because of the way in which these data are collected for LabID event, we do have a limited number of factors that we could use for risk adjustment because the denominators are collected at one denominator for the entire facility every month, which we're just getting admissions and patient days, and then we have survey level data. So, you know, we had to work with the data that were available to us, and so this was the best model that we could come up with. But But I did want to bring up a note about CDI Test Type. So we ask about CDI Test Type on an annual hospital survey, and beginning this year, you will be asked for CDI Test Type on your monthly denominator form for the last month in that calendar year quarter. All right, so the reason we decided to do this was because we noticed that facilities, as time is going on and C. diff surveillance is being performed, that your laboratory may move to a more sensitive test, which is going to increase the number of C. diff events that are identified by your hospital. And so we wanted to make sure that the risk adjustment that is being applied on the most current data that we could possibly get from you. And so retrospective by the last, calendar year wasn't good enough for us, especially when we start looking towards the end of 2014. It just wasn't, we just weren't comfortable enough with that measure. And we wanted to make sure that, again, in the face of public reporting, that we could use the most real-time information. So that's why we moved to a quarter level. I will say that we battled with, do we want to collect this every month? That's probably a little bit too much. What if there's data entry mistakes during month to month? What do we do with that data? And also the risk adjustment is performed on a quarterly level because of the prevalence rate. So that's why we moved to a quarter. So your SIRs for 2012 and 2013, they're still going to use the information that's on your most recent annual hospital survey. And looking at the data, I believe most hospitals have completed their 2013 survey, which is great. If you have not already, please do so that we can begin analyzing and preparing for our annual reports in a couple of months. But for 2014 and forward, the CDI LabID SIRs will use the test type that you report quarterly, okay? And you will be asked about this in March, June, September, and December. Another thing I want to bring up for everybody, we're starting to get this question, and what I love is that there are so many of you who are so eager to look at your data every month, and I think that is wonderful. And so what we're noticing is that folks are wanting to pull up their SIRs and look at it by month to make sure that they entered their data, that they can show their administration, yes, I am on time for CMS reporting, I'm good to go, look at me, and it's wonderful. However, because of the way we've set up this reporting for 2014, at this current moment, January and February data are considered incomplete because we don't have a test type yet to use. So once you complete your denominator data for March and you run those SIRs, you'll be able to see all 3 months of the quarter, okay? So we have been talking about that internally, is there something that we can do? Our recommendation at this time is to use the LabID rates that are available. That will actually provide more information for you because you'll be able to look at healthcare facility onset events as well as community onset events, look at prevalence rates included in that. So this is what the form will look like when you complete it in April, when you complete it for March 2014, okay? So we are using the same CDI test type options that you've seen on your annual hospital survey. And also, I believe we're only asking this at this time for acute care hospitals. I'm not sure if this comes up for LTACs or IRFs yet. So anyways, you will have the same options you see on the annual survey. And we do have an option for other. But I want to talk about that because I know I have contacted quite a few folks over the last year or two about other. Other should be selected when there is a if other is selected, when there's a more appropriate specific response on that form, your facility's data is not going to be risk adjusted to the most appropriate level. And I'll demonstrate that later on today. So it's really important that you get the correct information from your lab. Also, the choice of other should not be used to name specific laboratories, reference laboratories, or the brand names of C. difficile tests. The most of the methods used can be categorized accurately by selecting the options provided. So, yes, we're asking for this information on a quarterly level, but most of you, you're not going to be switching from quarter to quarter to quarter. At some point during the year, you may switch the CDI test type. But if you ask your lab, what do we use for a test, and they give you a brand name, say, could you please provide me with, can you please tell me which of these types of tests that we're using rather than the brand name? And I bring this up because when we were looking at the baseline data for risk adjustment, and then we were looking at the data again last year to produce a national metric, we noticed that there were quite a few hospitals that had selected other on their annual hospital survey. And what we had to do was we were like, okay, well, why are there so many others? I think for 2012 data, we had about 400 hospitals that had selected other. So we manually pulled up the comments, because when you select other, you have to specify what does other mean. So we pulled that up manually, and we were just kind of scanning through every single record to say what is actually being said here. And we noticed that there were a lot of hospitals that selected or that typed in an option that would have been available if they checked the correct box. So they may have written in the comments, nucleic acid amplification test. Well, that's actually an option. So their data are not risk adjusted appropriately. Or they would say, I send my, or I get my laboratory testing done at this laboratory. Well, that doesn't give us quite enough information. So it's really important that you try and reach out and say, I really need to know what test is used primarily for our hospital for this type of testing. This is the model for MRSA bacteremia LabID. I know the example that we're doing this morning is focusing on C. diff, but I did want to show you that it is a bit different than what we saw for C. difficile. So we have facility bed size is only broken up by greater than 400 versus less than or equal to 400 beds. Medical school affiliations, major teaching versus all others. So we have fewer risk factors that are used for MRSA bacteremia. So I did promise that I would demonstrate how this is applied with a negative binomial regression. So we're going to take a sample facility profile here just to demonstrate the MRSA bacteremia, because it's a little bit of a shorter model and, quite honest, a little bit easier to fit on the slide. So let's say it's a 450-bed major medical school affiliated hospital, and in 1 quarter's worth of data, you had over 23,000 patient days, 11,000 admissions, and 22 community onset MRSA bacteremia LabID events. So the reason I'm putting admissions and the number of community onset is for the calculation of the prevalence rate. So when we look at our model, this is how we plug everything in. So these first numbers here are the parameter estimates that came out of this table, and then these are the risk factors that correspond to each of those parameter estimates. And so when we plug in the presence of those risk factors, you can see how we multiply this all out. And again, this is all done within NHSN. I just want to give you some background information. And here's our prevalence rate here, okay, that we calculated out, and our patient days. So using this formula and our facilities profile for the quarter, we get 2.65 expected healthcare facility onset MRSA bacteremia. So I think that's the important point here. We're only looking to predict the healthcare facility onset events for our LabID SIRs. We're not looking to predict all of them, okay? Only the healthcare facility onset. So here's an example table of our C. diff SIR. So now we're going back to the example here where we want to focus on C. diff. Again, I'm just going to walk you through this table really quick. So our location is FAC-wide in. So again, there's one denominator form that you enter every month, and it is for all of your inpatient locations. So our location is just going to be FAC-wide in. We don't have the data available to split it up by location. We have our time period and the number of months column. Again, we talked about that yesterday, so it's important to make sure that, okay, if I'm looking at a half year and I know my data are all entered, I should see 6 months here. And if I don't, that could indicate a problem. Here we have our number observed, which we actually label as the number of C. diff incident healthcare facility onset LabID event count. So that's 45. So we identified 45 incident healthcare facility onset LabID events for C. diff, all right? That's our number observed. That will be our numerator for our SIR. And this is followed by the number expected for healthcare facility onset. So we are expecting 36.042, or we are predicting 36.042 incident healthcare onset LabID events. We do have our patient days available, and when we calculate out the SIR, we get an SIR of 1.249. So again, that's taking the 45, dividing that by 36.042. All right, so let's get to our first question here, and this is kind of a little review from yesterday, trying to wake you guys up. I think you all have, like, well, not everybody, but we scattered about some remotes for doing the voting. So I want to ask you what you think the p-value is. Is it 1, a probability, 2, the difference between two measures, 3, evidence of how rare an outcome is that it would not have happened just by chance, 4, how much higher or lower our rate is compared to the benchmark, or would you say it's both 1 and 4 or both 1 and 3? Okay, 10 seconds. All right, let's see how you guys did. All right, well, unfortunately, I can't tell the difference between 5 and 6 with the coloring on here, but I'm going to assume 80% said number 6, and you would be correct. The p-value is a probability, and it tells us how rare an outcome is that it would not have happened just by chance. So how rare is this SIR? All right, another review question from yesterday asking about confidence intervals. Okay, so which of these statements are true regarding 95% confidence intervals for SIRs? The 95% confidence interval tells us we're 95% confidence that our SIR is different than the national SIR. Is it that it tells us that we are confident that it contains the true SIR? If the 95% confidence interval includes our SIR, then there's no statistical significance. If the 95% confidence interval does not include 1, then there is a statistically significant difference. Or would we say both 1 and 4 or both 2 and 4? Okay, 10 seconds. All right. Now, again, I have a feeling I'm not going to tell the difference between 5 and 6, but I'm going to give you all the benefit of the doubt that you selected 5. Well, did you select 5 or 6? I don't know. Might have been 5. see what the right answer is. Oops. Where's my right answer? It's not on there. So the answer is 6. So it's both 2 and 4. It tells us that we were confident that it contains the true SIR, which I know it can be kind of difficult to wrap your head around that because you're thinking, what do you mean if it contains the true SIR? We just calculated what the SIR is. But again, that is technically an estimate. And of course, if that confidence interval does not include 1, there is no statistically significant difference. No, there is a statistically, sorry. Apparently, I need a little bit more coffee this morning. Okay, we're going to keep going. I've got another question for you, and then we can take a break from the questions. So we have our SIR table, the same one that I showed you a few slides ago. So how would you interpret the data in this table? 1, our facility identified 25% more HO-CDI events than predicted. 2, our facility's CDI LabID rate is 25% higher than the national average. 3, although our SIR is above 1, is not significantly higher than 1 based on statistical evidence. 4, our SIR indicates that we identified significantly more infections than predicted when looking at the statistical evidence. Or 5, both 1 and 3. Right? 10 seconds. All right. Let's see how you guys did. 93% said number 5, both 1 and 3. And congratulations, you are correct. So our facility identified 25% more HO-CDI events than predicted, because our SIR is 1.249, so you could say that's about 25%. And although it's above 1, it's not significantly higher than 1, and that's because our p-value is greater than 0.05, and our confidence interval kind of crosses that threshold of 1. So good job, everybody. That's great. And I'm happy to see nobody selected number 2, because I know that was something that we talked about yesterday, right? That while you can say that your rate is higher, you can't say that it's 25% higher. What we're actually looking at is the magnitude of the SIR rather than the rate. So, of course, you may not want to just stop at the SIR. I would recommend that you not just stop at the SIR. There are, of course, other pieces of information that can complement the SIR that is obtained from NHSN. You can use prevalence rates. I think it's important to look at what is coming into your hospital so that you can assess the burden. And so you could look at the community onset only prevalence rate, since that is a risk factor in the model. You could also look at the combined prevalence rate, which would include community onset healthcare facility associated or your co-HCFA events. You may want to look and see if there's any trends by patient care area, at least in the number of events that are identified, or see if there's any temporal trends during this time period. Are you noticing that, do you have a little bit of an outbreak situation? And you probably would have already picked up on that before you get to this end of the 6 months. But again, that's information that you can add to the story. You could also compare yourself to previous time periods. So how do we look in this last 6 months compared to the first 6 months of 2013? When we compare ourselves to ourselves, we can see how the experience is changing within our hospital. Are we noticing a significant improvement and reduction of C. diff, or are we starting to see a significant problem? And you would especially want to do this if you have any targeted prevention efforts that you implemented in your hospital. So just real quick on obtaining rates from NHSN. Again, these are in the MDRO LabID event reporting module. You would go to the organism specific LabID event folder. Not only can you get the line listing and frequency table, of course, but you can get the rate tables. Now, that rate table output option will include all of the different types of rates that we produce for you from NHSN. There is a description of each rate in the MDRO CDI module protocol. So I certainly recommend that you refer back to that to understand what's being calculated in those rates, because there's quite a few rate tables that could be helpful to you depending on what you're looking at. And with regard to the frequency table, you could use that with regard to C. diff particularly to see how many were incident, how many are recurrent, how many are healthcare onset, community onset, co-HICFA. We get this question a lot when folks are looking at their SIR and they're checking the numbers, which is wonderful, and they're saying, you know what, I should have 3 more events in this SIR. Why is this number not matching up? And we direct people to look towards the frequency table to see, okay, how many may have been recurrent cases, how many may have been categorized as co-HICFA. So I believe Lindsay will be talking about that this afternoon and demonstrating how to use that frequency table. Okay, as with other rates in NHSN, you can get the LabID rates by month or quarter, six-month time period, another cumulative time period. You can obtain the FAC-wide in rates, especially since that's the type of surveillance you're doing. But if your facility is voluntarily doing location-specific rates, meaning that you're entering an MDRO denominator for each individual location, you can get rates for that as well. We just don't have SIRs for individual locations. So if you've reported those data, you can certainly get rates out. One of the things I do want to mention, I've gotten this question a few times since yesterday, and we certainly realize that hospitals may need to generate an SIR or rates for a fiscal year. So it's not, you know, the nice clean calendar year that we refer to in our SIR reports when you select a year. I believe in your resource book, you should have a 1-page quick reference guide that is, how can I obtain cumulative rates or SIRs for a fiscal year or other cumulative time period. So if you, let's say, need to run an SIR from, you know, October through September, and you want to get one SIR, there's instructions on how to do that. Because otherwise, if you select your time period and hit run, you're actually going to get 2 SIRs by default. So those instructions will tell you how to go about doing that. All right, I do want to talk about the importance of data quality. And, you know, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, especially in the age of public reporting, but I want to go back to the CDI test type. You can tell I really want to drive this point home because I'm hoping that by the time we get to look at our 2013 data, we don't have to do very much cleanup at CDC. So this table, again, it's our SIR that I showed you before for C. diff. This hospital actually selected the nucleic acid amplification test, or NAT, on their survey. And so that's our SIR, and it, you know, it's great, it's accurate. But let's say that we had selected other for our CDI test type, and we indicated PCR in that little comments field next to other. I want to show you what happens. So notice that our number expected went from 36 to 24. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, we have the same number of events, and our denominator just dropped quite a bit, which means our SIR is now up to 1.8, and we are now significantly higher than 1. Okay? So that's why, you know, if sometimes if anybody hears from us about cleaning up data and you're rolling your eyes like, really? Like, ugh. There's a reason for it. It's not really so much as to protect us, but we also want to make sure that your data are going to be reported appropriately and accurately. And, we would hate for you to have an SIR on hospital compare that's much higher than it should be, okay? And unfortunately, we don't have a system, an automatic method for us to look at every single one. It is a painstaking task to go through manually to check those data. So, please be sure the data are accurate so that you can get an appropriate SIR. All right, we're going to move on to example number 2. Example number 1 kind of took up a lot of time. I didn't expect it so much, but I think we haven't really taught on the LabID SIR with the exception of APIC last year, so hopefully you all found that helpful. So for this example, let's say that you've been performing SSI surveillance for 7 procedure categories. Obviously, we're a very large hospital. We have a lot of resources with which we can do this. And we've been reporting these data to NHSN. And you've been asked to report a measurement for your facility's SSI experience for all of these procedures for 2013 at your next committee meeting. So we're going to use the SIR. I say you decide to use the SIR. I'm kind of deciding that for you. Many of you know, if you've been doing SSI surveillance for a while, for a long time, then you know that we used to measure SSI incidents by using rates, and we risk stratified those rates using what was called the basic risk index. And that took into account 3 factors. It took into account the procedure duration, the ASA score, and the surgical wound class, and that was it. And all of those risk factors were used for every single procedure category. So it was limiting our ability to maybe accurately measure the risk for each of these procedure categories. So in 2010, we replaced SSI rates or risk stratified rates by SSI SIRs. You can still get rates in the advanced folder of the output options. We have left them there. So you can get your facilities rates that use that basic risk index, but we don't have any pooled means. We removed those. We have not published pooled means for SSI rates since 2009, which included data from 2006 to 2008. That also happens to be the baseline period for our SSI SIRs. So just know we don't have those rates available anymore at a national level. And, part of that reason is because we found that with this new risk adjustment, which I'm going to show you that uses the SIRs, it's an improvement upon the risk adjustment that was previously used. And so we have opted to use that as a national level. Also, you'll see that because there are so many different risk factors that are used and the way that they're used to produce rates that are risk stratified using those improved risk models would produce thousands of rates. And you end up getting to a point where your volume is so low in each one of those strata that it's hard to draw any meaning from those rates. So, for SSIs, we calculate the number expected by actually summing the procedure risk for all procedures included in a summarized calculation. So what this means is that we take every single procedure record that you enter into NHSN and we calculate the SSI risk for that procedure. And then we take all of those individual records and we add the risk up, and I'll demonstrate how that's done. And that's how we get the number expected. Again, we use 2006 to 2008 data as the baseline, and these are improved risk models, improvement over the basic risk index that was previously used. So this table lists the available risk factors in NHSN from the 2006 to 2008 baseline period. And I wanted to make sure I put that 2006 to 2008 up there because for those doing SSI surveillance, you know that in 2014, you're now required to provide a height and weight. as well as diabetes, for every procedure you report to us. And previously, those risk factors had only been required and available for specific procedure categories. So with that being said, we are collecting height, weight, and diabetes so that we can hopefully use those as risk factors when we rebaseline the data. We can't use those today because we didn't have the data available to us in 2006 to 2008. So we've been getting that question quite a bit about, well, I'm entering these data. Are these used in the SIRs? Not quite yet, but we want to get there some days, which is why we have to collect those now. So we ask kindly for your patience while we do that. So you can see here that there's quite a bit of data available for risk factors. And so, limiting to just those 3 risk factors in the risk index, we were unfortunately not able to, it wasn't the best comparison for us when we have all of this wealth of data available to review. So I think I may have actually put my slides out of order, unfortunately, or maybe not. So here is just a table that shows our logistic regression model for SSIs after vaginal hysterectomy. This is pulled from the paper that's available on our website that was published in 2011. So you can see here that we have 4 different risk factors for this procedure type. We use the patient's age, and this is the age at the time of procedure, the ASA score, the procedure duration, and whether or not that hospital is affiliated with a medical school. Parameter estimates, we use those just like we did in the negative binomial regression with what you saw with C. diff and MRSA. This here is actually the odds ratio and the p-value. So that's information we provided in the paper, but what we're really focused on right now are these parameter estimates. So this calculation, this model, looks a little bit similar to what we saw with the LabID stuff, but now you notice there's this logit here. So what do you need to know? Well, basically, it's very similar to what you saw before. We plug in the numbers, okay? This is what we do for you. We plug in these parameter estimates with presence of a risk factor. Again, if a risk factor is present, we put a 1, otherwise it's 0. So if we had a sample patient who is 40 years old, the procedure ASA score was 4, the procedure duration is 117 minutes, and the medical school affiliation is yes for that hospital. What you need to know is the ending result, okay? So all of this is done for you. Again, this is just to help you understand how we get to that end result for that procedure. So for this individual patient, for the single patient, this ends up being a 0.032 or 3.2% risk is actually how you could interpret that number for that patient. So this is what we would do for all of our records entered into NHSN. If you had 100 sample patients, we would actually take this probability of SSI. The risk could also be referred to as a probability. And you could add those up to get the number expected for those 100 patients. So it's 2.91 in this case. So if they observed 3 infections and 2.91 were expected, you get an SIR of about 1. This is just another example. I wanted to show this for colo procedures, and I will just put a little disclaimer here that this is not the risk model that is used for CMS reporting. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is a different model. It uses quite a few risk factors that are reported to NHSN, and when we apply that, this right-hand column that says risk using all SSI model, that is the individual risk for each one of these patients. So the reason I bring this up is because you can get this line listing from NHSN, okay? If you are interested in seeing the calculated risk for each one of your procedures and patients, you can do that. And that may be information that's helpful when you're, giving this information back to surgeons. And I thought I had somewhere, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my slides here. Yes, I will show you in a few slides how you can get this information, but I just want to let you know that you can get it out. Again, NHSN calculates SIRs for you, so you don't have to worry about doing that by hand. Again, that is provided that you've been reporting these data to NHSN. And so, we certainly know it's a lot. It takes a lot of time to get those data into the system. We certainly appreciate how much time it can take. But because of the risk adjustment that's applied, that's the information that's needed. That's why we have to get all of those individual records, and you can't just enter a summary record. We have multiple SSI SIR output options. I will be describing those for you, but for our example, we're going to be using the all SSI SIR report. There are some things you need to know about exclusion criteria. So I've labeled this as Universal Exclusion Criteria for the SSI SIR. So regardless of the type of SIR you're looking at, whether it's one for just CMS reporting or the all SSI SIR, we do have some sets of exclusion criteria. The ones on this slide are specifically related to potential data quality issues. And these are exclusion criteria that were applied when we were doing the risk adjustment on those data for 2006 through 2008. So we want to apply those same exclusion criteria to your hospital's data. And so one of the frequent questions we get is, why are some procedures excluded from my SIR? One of the most common reasons is because you have a procedure with a duration that is considered extremely high. We've referred to this as the IQR5. We do have information available about that online, and I thought I provided a reference here, but Lindsay, I think Lindsay might be talking about it today as well, so we will be covering it. But basically what we're trying to say is, okay, procedure duration is used as a risk factor in many of these models, and if you have a procedure duration that is extremely high, let's say it's a complicated procedure, or the patient had to go back into the ER that same, or not the ER, but the OR that same day, and so they may have a duration that's 10 hours for a procedure where most of them may be within 6 hours. So what we're saying is, because it's so high, we consider that to be an outlier, and the risk adjustment that we apply wouldn't be appropriate for that individual patient. So we exclude that record from the SIRs. The good news is this should be rare that you would encounter this. There's nothing that you would have to fix. If you know that the duration that you reported for that record is accurate, you don't have to fix anything. We're just going to exclude it, okay? I listed at the bottom here that when you have a wound class that's unknown, or an approach or a spinal level that's not specified, or N, that those procedures are also excluded from the SIR. However, beginning with 2014 procedures, we no longer allow you to report those types of values. So you can no longer report unknown or not specified. Again, the occurrence of this should be incredibly rare. If you're coming across where you're like, well, all of my procedures have a not specified approach, you need to go back to the drawing board and figure out how can we get this information if we're going to be reporting these data. I guess I did touch on this a little bit. Good. So we do provide a line listing of the procedures that are excluded from the SSI SIR. Again, since all these instances should be rare, your line list should hopefully not be too long, but you can always modify it and limit it to a time period or a procedure category if you want. It is available under that procedure associated module folder and then in the SSI folder, and it's at the very bottom of that long list. We do have additional universal exclusion criteria that are not necessarily related to data quality issues, but are related to other issues. Not with your data, but just with what we're able to do with it. So the SIRs will exclude superficial incisional secondary SSIs as well as the deep incisional secondary SSIs. And that's because when we were running through the risk models, we realized, well, we really don't have a duration for that secondary incision. We don't have a wound class for that secondary incision, so we want to exclude those from the SIRs. You can always obtain information about these from frequency tables and from line lists. We don't want you to ignore them completely, but they're not included in that calculation. Also, since we are still using that baseline of 2006 to 2008, the procedures that you report in 2014 that are reported with a closure technique of other than primary will be excluded from the SIRs, as well as any SSIs that are linked to those procedures, okay? So for this time being, they will be excluded. Again, you can get information on that from your frequency tables, from your line lists, if you want to see what procedures were reported with a technique that's other than primary for that closure type. Okay, I promised you I would talk a little bit about the SSI SIR options in NHSN. While most of our example will be focused on the all SSI SIR model, this table is included in the analysis section of your SSI protocol. We get a lot of questions from folks. What is the difference between these? And so we wanted to provide some sort of detailed list. And if any of you have emailed me about this, you've probably seen this same list because I stole it right out of an email that I sent to somebody. So, so the all SSI model, or the all SSI SIR option, is really based on an all SSI model. And that would include superficial, deep, and organ space SSIs. Of course, none of the secondary ones. It's limited to just the primary, superficial, and deep. And it will include SSIs identified on admission, readmission, and through post-discharge surveillance. So it is trying to encompass all of the SSIs. The next one is called the complex AR model. This will actually include only SSIs that are identified on admission or readmission to the facility where the procedure was performed. So readmission to your hospital. That's the A and R in that title. It will include only inpatient procedures, and it will include only deep incisional primary and organ space SSIs. So you're not going to get superficial incisional SSIs when you run the SIRs for complex A&R. Okay, we're trying to get at the more complex level type of infections here. And when this model was developed, we did that with the purpose of using this for public reporting from our standpoint. So when we produce SIRs for a national level or for the state-specific SIRs, these will be coming out in our report in a couple of weeks, we use this complex A&R model. However, we have a third one. It's called a complex 30-day. This is the one that is used for your CMS reporting. This is the one that we will submit to CMS on behalf of your hospital, and it is the one that is used on Hospital Compare. And this model is the result of the CDC working together with the American College of Surgeons, that we were tasked with coming up with a harmonized measure for the CMS reporting purposes. And it needed to be an NQF endorsed measure. And so with that, this is the result of that harmonized measure and the best thing that we were able to produce. This will include only in-plan, inpatient, colon and hyst procedures in adult patients, so they are 18 years of age or older. It includes only deep incisional primary and organ space SSIs with an event date that is within 30 days of the procedure date. And it uses only age and ASA to determine the risk, okay? So it is a different subset of patients and procedures with a different risk calculation. For the all and the complex AR models, these are actually described in the paper that was published in 2011. So I've included just screen captures of those here, really just to demonstrate that we do describe these in detail regarding the risk factors, the parameter estimates for each of those, if you're interested in looking at that, or providing that to your surgeons. I did show you a sample of a line list where you can look at the calculated risk for each individual procedure that you report to NHSN. You can get this information by going to the advanced section and then the procedure level data, and then go to line listing all procedures. Now, I will tell you, you'll have to modify that because otherwise your line list could be really long with few variables that we've set up by the default. So these variables that you can add are listed here. These are the variable names. The model risk complex will be the complex AR, and the model risk complex 30D is the 30-day model that is used for CMS reporting. Again, this is just showing the SIR models at the procedure level. So this is one list of procedures. And I've kind of cut out all the risk factors because they wouldn't really fit on the screen so that you'd be able to see it. So I've just included each of the model risk variables here. And so you can see how they differ for a single patient. We go from a 0.064 to 0.028 to 0.0181. So I'm going to ask you a question now. This table of patients includes some of the significant risk factors for patients that are undergoing the same NHSN procedure category. So using the information in this table, which patient do you think is at highest probability of SSI? Patient 1, 2, 3, 4, or it depends on which SIR you're measuring. And the voting has opened. Okay, 10 seconds left. All right. Let's see how you guys did. All right, so it looks like 84% of you said patient number 2. We did have a few folks that said number 5. It depends on which SIR you're measuring. And I'm going to be honest with you. When I was putting together this slide and these data, I was kind of thinking number 5 as well. I was like, well, yeah, it could depend on the SIR you're measuring. But in this case, the answer is patient number 2. And why is that? Well, it's because this patient is at highest risk according to all 3 risk models. Okay, so if we didn't have patient number 2, it would depend on the model because for one model, patient number 3 looks at highest risk. But then if we look at a different risk model, patient number 4 is at highest risk. So, you know, if you need to provide this level of information, or if you're digging into this level of information, be sure you're aware of what are we trying to measure here. Are we trying to look at the probability of of getting any kind of SSI, or are we specifically focused on those more complicated types of infections, those more complex infections like deep incisional or organ space? Or are we interested in just looking at the data that are publicly reported for CMS? So this just gets at what I was talking about, which SIR model to use. If you want to look at the incidence of all of the SSIs in your facility, regardless of type or detection, then you choose all SSI. If you're interested in only more complex infections or those identified upon admission to your hospital, then you choose the complex AR. And then, of course, if you're interested in verifying the colo and HIS data that are submitted to CMS, you want to look at the complex 30-day SIR. And I will say that if you're reporting for CMS these SSI data, you should be looking at that. I mean, that should just be part of your process, so you're aware of what's being submitted. And then potentially look at the other two models to see what they produce for you. This is our output for the all SSI SIR for select procedures. For 2013, notice this is an overall table. So even though we're looking at 7 procedure categories, this is a single SIR for all of them. Of course, we have our columns in yellow. That's like the NHSN data and comparisons, and this is our facilities data. So 1,700 procedures, 35 infections. Oh, and notice here in the footnotes, got to go back to those footnotes, we do provide a little bit of information about it excluding the secondary SSIs, and that it only includes procedures that are reported with the primary closure technique while we use this same baseline. All right, so based on our p-value and the 95% confidence interval, is the number of observed infections statistically significantly different from the number expected? Yes, no, or not sure. You can begin voting, and they're coming in really quick. So I know you guys really know this stuff. It's great. 10 seconds left. All right. 95% said yes, you are correct. And the reason is that the p-value is less than 0.05. The confidence interval, both of those, the upper and the lower bound, are less than 1. So we see that we have a statistically significant difference. All right, you saw something similar yesterday when we were talking about counties. So this is a overall general interpretation of your SIR data for SSIs. We can run through the number of infections, how many were expected or predicted. Our SIR in this case is 0.691, so it indicates that we observed approximately 31% fewer infections than expected. So great. It's below 1. It's significant. We can go home now, right? Like, we can stop. There's nothing else we need to do. I say not so fast. So I modified this slide a little bit from yesterday, because yesterday we were focused on rate tables and device-associated SIRs, but today we're talking about SSIs. So again, covering the elements of this interpretation, the basics, the numbers. What are our numbers? How many observed? How many did we predict? What's our SIR? Are we better? Are we worse? But then you want to start to highlight successes or pitfalls, right? And talk about what is the plan. So are there any procedure categories where you had no SSIs identified? Are there any trends in SIRs going up? And any SIRs going down? Are you going to be looking at the SIRs for a specific surgeon or a procedure category? Or maybe a group of surgeons? Maybe you're interested in all orthopedic procedures. Very similar list to what we saw yesterday. And, you know, one of the things I've also have in here that I didn't touch on yesterday is, you know, when you're interpreting these data and you're presenting these to somebody, you know, you may want to highlight as well if there's been any internal or external validation programs that have taken place during this time period. You know, one of the things that we're going to be mentioning in our HAI progress report that's coming out is that, you know, for states that perform validation of hospitals' data, they may actually have higher SIRs because they're going to be possibly identifying more infections than were originally reported. So you'd want to highlight that when you're interpreting these data and make sure to keep that in mind. If you're interested in looking at SIRs by each individual procedure category, this is a table that is provided for you in your SSI SIR tables. It is, I believe, the second table. We provide this with the p-value and the 95% confidence interval. You can see a procedure category's contribution to the overall SIR, including the number of expected infections. You can also view changes over time for each procedure category. So if you wanted to kind of look at these by quarter, if you have some specific initiatives that had taken place for a certain type of procedure category or group, you could certainly do that by looking at the SIR table here, see how things have changed. So I do want to highlight, it's very similar to what we talked about yesterday, a translation from procedure-specific SIRs to the overall, because remember, we consider the SIR a summarized, risk-adjusted measurement of your HAIs. So just like we saw yesterday, and what we talked about earlier today too, is that the number expected for each procedure category is first pretty much calculated at the patient level, and then we sum it up for each procedure category. In order to get the total, while we do have, again, the overall procedure count, we don't want to use that to calculate a rate, but we do have from NHSN the number of infections and the number expected just by totaling up all of the infections identified across the board and all of the number expected. And of course, the SIR is not a sum of the individual SIRs. It's not an average of the individual SIRs, but rather we take it we calculate it by taking the number of infections divided by the total number expected or predicted. And that's how we get our 0.691. So based on this table above, and we've been seeing this for a few slides now, which procedure category do you think has the highest contribution to the overall SIR? Would you say 1, fusions, 2, cabbages, the CBGB, 3, the knee procedures, K-Pro, or 4, colon procedures? Ten more seconds. All right. See what you guys had to say. All right, so we've got some mixed reviews here. This is great. This is actually what I was planning. So 40% of you said that cabbages contributed, had the highest contribution to the overall SIR. And then 56% of you said that it was colon procedures that had the overall contribution to the SI, or the highest contribution to the overall. So let's see what the answer is. It is number 4, and I will explain why. It is because, let's look at the number of infections and the number expected. Remember, the overall SIR adds up the number observed, the number expected across all these procedure categories. I understand why some of you said cabbages, and it's because their SIR is 2.19. Right? I'm guessing that's why you selected it, right? And they do have a high SIR. And you know what? In all honesty, that's probably something you'd want to pick out and say, you know what? I know it's not statistically significant, but I'm going to be looking into that. We need to figure out what's going on here. But the call-in procedures are what contributed to the most to that overall SIR. Remember, we had 35, I believe, observed infections, and 21 of them were colos. And to be honest, I don't remember the number expected, but colos took up the majority of that. They had 30 expected out of those groups of procedures. Example number 3, we're going to continue on this SSI path. So due to the high number of colo procedures performed during this year and the high incidence of SSI following these procedures, you've been asked to provide more specifics regarding these data to your chief surgeon. You begin your analysis by looking at both the all SSI SIR and the complex ANR SSI SIR. So these are the two tables. The first one is the one that we've been looking at, the all SSI data, where we have 21 infections observed, 30 expected or predicted. The bottom is the complex ANR SSI SIR, with 9 observed and 13 expected. Given the results of these two SIRs, what conclusions can you begin to make? 1, regardless of SIR risk model, our SSI experience remains the same. Based on risk adjustment, fewer colo patients are at risk for a deep incisional or organ space SSI. 3, more than half of the SSIs identified are superficial incisional SSIs. Or 4, we need to do more digging. All right, 10 seconds. All right. I do believe I tricked you all. So our answers are all across the board, and that's good. That's kind of what I was going for. There's a teaching moment here, I promise you. So the answer here is number 4. We have to do more digging. I tricked you. We don't have enough information here. So why is that? Well, you know, our SIRs between these two models are very similar to each other. One is 0.69 and one is 0.672. So that's why you may have said, well, our experience is about the same. But not really, because, you know, we're using different risk models to predict, okay, how many, where the first one is looking at how many SSIs in total are we predicting to occur versus how many of these more complicated infections with a specific set of detection methods are we trying to predict to occur. So the first one, we had 21 infections, and this one only has 9. All right, so we need to figure out why. Now, the complex AR is only going to include deep incisional and organ space infections, so that's why you may have said, well, about half are superficial. However, the complex ANR only includes those identified on admission or readmission. So you may have said, well, maybe about half are identified on post-discharge surveillance. So I've provided this table here just for the comparison of the two different models, the all SSI and the complex AR, as a little checklist about what's included and what's not. So we have to break these up when we start talking about the types of SSIs and the detection methods. We can't just say, well, half are superficial, because we don't know. We may have some deep incisional infections that were identified through post-discharge surveillance, and that would be excluded. So What I've done here, this is a frequency table that I ran, and I already limited this to look at only colon procedures, only during this specific time period. So we're looking at the specific event or the specific type of SSI by the detection method or how it was detected. I've defined these here. Notice that we have a category for readmission to another hospital. So that's the patient goes to a hospital other than where the procedure was performed. We are specifically pulling those out. And we're calling those readmission, but they're not readmission to your facility. And in the baseline data, those were considered post-discharge surveillance, or one method of post-discharge surveillance. So the cells that I have highlighted are the counts of SSIs that are excluded from the complex AR SSI SIR. So notice that we do have an organ space infection that was identified through post-discharge surveillance. So that's going to be excluded from that complex AR measurement. We also have an organ space one that was identified on readmission to an other hospital. And then we have our superficial incisional primary infections. But wait, oh boy, there's always a wait. The table shows our total number of SSIs is 22, but our all SSI model, which should include everything, right? It only showed 21. Uh-oh. So I wanted to bring you this example. Actually, I have to tell you, that just happened by dumb luck. I was running the frequency table, and I was like, wait a minute, my numbers don't match up. So now I have to do some digging, and I'm going to teach you how to do that digging. So when I ran my SIRs, at the bottom, there's a table that includes the counts of procedures and SSIs linked to those procedures that are excluded from your SIRs in the table above. And given this, you can then look at that line list that we provided that will list all of the procedure level information for the procedures excluded. So notice that for this colo, and I'm sorry, I didn't update that time period, so just ignore that. It's supposed to be 2013. But notice that for colons, we had 4 procedures that were excluded, and one of those had an SSI attributed to it. So that's why we have 22 SSIs in our frequency table, but only 21 in our SIR. So we're going to summarize this colo experience. In 2013, for our example, there were 22 total SSIs identified. The colo SIR for all SSIs was 0.693. However, the statistical evidence does not indicate that there were significantly fewer infections than predicted. Of the 22 SSIs identified, 1 was excluded because it was attributed to a procedure with an extremely long procedure duration. That just happens to be the reason in this case. 9 were identified as deep incisional or organ space infections, and 13 were identified during a stay at our facility. And when we focus our SIR measurement on those SSIs that were deep incisional or organ space and or detected during an admission to this facility. So I kind of summarized that categorization of being identified on the current admission during which the procedure took place or readmission to our facility. I summarize that here as an admission to this facility. Our SIR is about the same at 0.672. As always, there's more to the story. And these are just some things to get you thinking. This is kind of something that we talked about in our elements of interpretation for these data. So SIRs, again, they're a summary measure. So there are additional details that you can obtain from NHSN if you don't already have this information available. In some cases, you may want to look at the age of patients, the type of SSIs, which we already did. Maybe you're interested in looking at the time from the procedure to the event and the number of days between that procedure and the SSI event. You may want to include the method of detection, which is something that we included in our interpretation. Maybe you're interested in looking at the surveillance criteria that were used to define each SSI. So remember yesterday, I said that when you run event level line lists from NHSN, you can get information on all of the criteria that were used to identify each SSI. That's information that you entered into NHSN. So you can get that back out. You may be interested in looking at that. Pathogen information, if it's applicable. You may be interested in looking at the individual risk for every procedure or patient. You can look at that by surgeon if you wanted to. Frequency tables and line lists, they can also be really helpful to you if you're doing any internal validation activities in your hospital. Especially if you are importing these data into NHSN and you may not be aware of maybe some default values being used. So you can see, is there an overclassification of higher ASA scores? Are all of ours being identified as an ASA of 5? Okay, that's something you want to look at. Are there any surgeons with consistently higher procedure durations compared to other surgeons in that same procedure category? Is there any surgeon that performs more surgeries as a result of trauma? Is wound class being appropriately assigned? So these are types of things that you can dig into more, and this information is available within NHSN. So, you know, I guess what I'm trying to drive home here is that you do a lot of work for the surveillance and for data entry, and we really want you to get something back out of it. And so this information can really be helpful to you, especially if you're working on any special initiatives for SSIs. But I have a big tip here for all of you. When you run SSI frequency tables and line lists, be sure to limit by the procedure date and not the event date, not the admission date, in order to align with the SIR. So if your goal is to provide detailed information to complement your SIR, you need to run these data by the procedure date. Otherwise, you're going to have a mismatch, right? Because the SSI could occur in a month different from when the procedure occurred. And the SIRs will always use the date of procedure when summarizing those data. All right. Time to move on to example number 4. And this is where we start talking about precision, practical significance. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I think it is worth mentioning, especially in this day and age. We know we have a lot of smaller hospitals reporting data. So here we have Hospital A and Hospital B. They've both been performing SSI surveillance in 2013. Hospital A is a 150-bed academic facility, and Hospital B is a smaller 50-bed hospital with no medical school affiliation. So why do I bring this up? Well, I bring up this information because these are factors that can have an impact on the SIR, because some of these may be significant risk factors when we do those calculations. So a smaller hospital that doesn't have a medical school affiliation could have a lower number of predicted infections, depending on the procedures they're monitoring, than would a larger hospital that has a strong academic affiliation. So why do I bring this up? Well, if you notice between Hospital A and Hospital B, their SIRs are similar. They're both around 1.6. Actually, you could probably round that up to about 1.7. But our statistical results differ. The p-value for Hospital A is statistically significant, and it is not for Hospital B. And we get the same results when we look at the 95% confidence interval. So I bring this up because it's not all about just that number. This p-value and 95% confidence interval is an indication of precision. So Hospital A, their expected number of infections is higher, indicating either higher volume, higher risk procedures. So we consider that measurement to be more precise than we would for the smaller hospital. All right. We're going to talk a little bit more about precision. Hospital B also reported COUTI and CDI LabID data. I haven't specified a time period here, but notice we have, just very few infections identified. The expected is less than 1, so we don't have an SIR, we don't have a p-value, and we don't have a 95% confidence interval. So what we're getting at here is there are not enough data in order to even expect or predict one infection of each type. Now, one of the things I do want to mention, I forgot to mention yesterday, is, we withhold the SIR because, we want to help enforce precision, we want to aid in the interpretation, but also, these data are now used for public reporting, and they are put on Hospital Compare's website. So imagine you are a small hospital. Imagine you do have less than 1 expected infection. And imagine if we were to post an SIR or have CMS post an SIR for your hospital and your SIR is 2 or 3, and it's going to look much higher than any other larger hospital that is up there. Is that fair? You have such a low volume of procedures, so we're trying to make a balance here of precision and putting out a measurement that is most suitable for that. What can Hospital B do? Now, I'm not going into great depth about this, and again, this is just one idea. It's not the end-all, be-all. Hospital B, depending on the time period that we're looking at here, they can look at monthly or quarterly COUTI rates to assess device use, as well as determine when the COUTIs occurred. They can generate SIRs for a longer time period, such as a year or 18 months. And again, that really, if you're going to be looking at SIRs and you can only rely on an entire year, hopefully you're already using rates as well to track incidents over time, and you're not just waiting until the very end. And you can focus on the practical significance of the data. While helpful, sophisticated statistics are not always required when interpreting internal data. The caveat to this is that statistical significance is used when interpreting data on websites like Hospital Compare. But when you're reporting these data internally, you don't necessarily have to rely on that. So let's use our COUTI data in this example. We can say that 2 infections were identified, but not even 1 was predicted to occur. So this alone could be cause for concern in the hospital, maybe. That's where having some additional information can help. Are these 2 infections that were identified like in the last month? And maybe you had a rate of 0 going on for the whole year. And then if this is 1 year's worth of data, maybe just in December you had 2 COUTIs. So were there changes in staff? Were there changes in devices, how they were maintained? Has this been a trend over previous time periods of this length? You have to decide how actionable is this for our hospital. And again, this gets back at your own internal reporting purposes. If we go back to Hospital B's SSI data, where we do have an SIR, depending on what Hospital B is trying to assess, what their prevention and reduction goals are, they may wish to make decisions regardless of statistical results. It just depends on the decisions that you have to make. Do you want to continue or increase prevention efforts for SSIs? Additional information, of course, may help. Are these attributed to a specific procedure category or surgeon? When are these identified? What type of SSIs were identified? Did these 4 happen following procedures that were performed just last month? So even though our SIR is not significantly higher than 1, we can still use that information to decide, okay, we still want to make some decisions on this. We're not just going to sit back and say, well, it's not significant, so we're okay. There's still something that could potentially be done. Moving on to internal comparisons. So I certainly did not want to forget about our colleagues at long-term acute care hospitals. There are so many that are also reporting data. So let's say you work at an LTAC and you've been performing surveillance for CLABSI and COUTI. And due to the location type and the fact that it is an LTAC type unit, you're unable to obtain an SIR. So the reason for this is because when we compiled baseline data, we had one type of LTAC location. Well, in preparing for LTAC reporting for CMS, we actually created two different types of LTAC locations to be used by LTAC hospitals. And they have the choice of critical care LTAC or a ward level LTAC. And those rates are significantly different from each other. So we're essentially saying we don't have the baseline data yet, although I will tell you we have begun working on that this year. So while SIRs are coming, we don't have them yet. So what can we do with that? And this can apply to other units as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare ourselves. We're going to look at our rates, not only compared to national data, but what's our rate during two different 6-month time periods. So what I'm about to discuss, again, I kind of mentioned that these methods can be used for other location types within the acute care setting, such as telemetry wards, mixed acuity wards, inpatient rehabilitation facilities, or IRF units within acute care hospitals. Why did I mention those specifically? Well, these are also units that would be excluded from SIR calculations. I mentioned yesterday telemetry wards, we're asked about that frequently. So you may wish to use these internal comparisons. You could use these internal comparisons for any unit. It's not just dependent on what's included or excluded in the SIR. I think it's a good idea regardless, but these are options for these other units. Just to make a mention of mixed acuity wards, mixed acuity wards, as the name kind of suggests, it's not well defined. So hospitals that have mixed acuity wards could include those units that use a universal bed concept where the patient changes acuity level but never leaves that bed or that unit. It could also be a unit that has, let's say, a 50-50 mix of ICU level beds and patients and then 50% mix of step-down patients. And you're unable to split those data up for your surveillance purposes. Well, you could use a mixed acuity ward, but at a national level, we don't know what that means. We could have mixed acuity wards that are step down and ward. We could have them that are ICU and ward. There's a constant mix. We've even have hospitals that have said, well, I have a mixed acuity ward that is specific to cardiac patients. Okay, well, they're going to look different than just a general mixed acuity ward. So we have not, to this date, published pooled means for that location type. So we already talked about yesterday our COUTI output options in the rate table. So we're going to pretend that we ran a rate table for our LTAC location for COUTI data. And this is our rate table that came out. Now we ran this by half year. That's the 2013 H1. So that's 6 months, the first 6 months of 2013, January through June, and then July through December. We do have the NHSN pooled mean. We have our own facilities COUTI rate. And we can get our p-values and see how we are national compared to national data. Well, what can we say about these data without running a statistical test to compare the two time periods? We do see that our COUTI rate decreased over two time periods, so we went from 5.9 to 2.9. The number of urinary catheter days was nearly the same, but our catheter use is unknown. I didn't include it here. Normally you would get that device utilization ratio out, but it's not included in the specific table. So we have something called the statistics calculator. You may actually have a quick reference guide that's 3 or 4 pages that talks about all of these different options for the statistics calculator. Just to walk you briefly through this, the compare to proportions option is if you want to compare, let's say, two device utilization ratios from two different time periods. You would use the two proportions. You can compare the single SIR to 1. And that may be helpful if you're calculating your own SIRs. I know something that we've gotten questions about a lot is folks who want an SIR for VAP data, and we don't have that. So if you wanted to get crafty and use what you consider a baseline report, look at pooled means, go through the motions and calculate your SIR, you can do that. And this calculation will actually give you the p-value and confidence interval for that. But you have to know the number expected and the number predicted, or number observed. Compared to standardized infection ratios, so that will actually look at the relative change. How much have we changed in our hospital from this first 6 months to the next 6 months? And then we have two incidence density rates, comparing two incidence density rates, which is what we will talk about today. Remember, incidence density rates are rates produced that are using person time in the denominator. So the amount of time at which patients were at risk for that specific type of infection. So we're going to use that option. Notice that we have just a couple of fields to complete. We have labels for each data source. So I put January to June and July through December. The numerator is the number of events. The denominator is number of person time units. In this case, our urinary catheter days. And then you have an option to select a multiplier. And we did that because there are now different types of incidence density rates in NHSN that use different multipliers. So C.diff incidence rates actually use a multiplier of 10,000 to aid in the interpretation. So we selected 1,000 because we're using county rate data. Actually, I almost hit calculate on that. That shows you how much I've been using our application. So here's the results that are generated for us. Again, we entered the infections and our denominator, and what this output produces is our incidence density rate, which you already know because you got that from NHSN, but this will calculate it for you. And then it gives you a p-value. So it is comparing these two time periods to see if they are significantly different from each other. So given this p-value, and based on our statistical evidence, we can say we did not observe a significant change in this location's county rate. So in statistically speaking, we did not see a change. However, from a practical point, we could say, you know what? That's really good though. We went from 5.9 to 2.2. So, good job. So in summary, and this is a little bit earlier than I expected, but not too much. And I'm sorry this is not in your slides. When I was going through this the other day, I'm like, oh my God, I didn't even summarize anything that we talked about here. So remember that the SIRs for LabID and SSI data provide a summarized risk-adjusted measure of incidence in your hospital. Additional reports from NHSN provide detailed information that can help supplement your rates and SIRs. So, don't forget about all the information you took so much time to collect and enter. There are times where practical significance may be more useful than statistical significance, particularly with small hospitals. And internal comparisons and trend analysis can help you speak to your facility's experience over time. That's certainly something that we do at the national level and with state level data. And so I'm going to end this summary with a quote from one of my favorite musicians and say, the road is short, but the river is long. And for me, in this context, I take this as the data that we give you, that's your road. There's just one little snapshot. But the story that you have to tell is long, and there's a lot to say about it. So, we urge you to really own the data that you have and to really tell that story and not forget about all that you have to say. So I've included additional resources here, of course, that we have on our website, the papers. Also, I included a reference to our colleague Kate Ellingson. She wrote a really great article last year for AGIC about breaking down p-values and 95% confidence intervals for IPs. It's an amazing article. I think it's about 2 pages. So if you have not read that yet, I recommend that you do. I think it'll be really helpful for you. So I thank you all for your time and attention. You've done a great job. I've heard a lot of great questions from all of you that I hope will help advance some of our training and materials that we have. So keep the questions coming to us in the NHSN mailbox. You guys did a great job today. And at this point, I'm ready for any questions you may have. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. Very informative. I have 2 questions.
Okay.
One has to do with the risk adjustment model for C. difficile for the SIR.
Yep.
And many of us were surprised whenever the presence of a oncology specialty unit wasn't in that risk adjustment model, given the higher rates of C. diff in BMT patients.
Okay.
Did you guys put it in the initial run and it didn't come out significant, or was it not included?
Okay, so you're looking at why didn't we risk adjust for patients that are of that type?
Right, in the SIR,
patients.
Given the body of literature that says they are at much higher risk.
So, I mean, I think that's, a really good point to the limitations to the data that we have. So we only have that for the events, not for the denominator. At this point. So we also have a limited number of cancer hospitals that were contributing to data during that time. So I think that's something that we could start to keep in mind, when we re-baseline these data. We do want to look at additional factors such as even a facility type or a facility that has those oncology patients and those units to see what we can do if it factors in.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is regarding the October of last year newsletter guidance directing facilities to break down their NHSN number into specific buildings. And if that were to actually be done, wouldn't that destroy the facility size risk adjustment for surgery, given that many of those people took guidance from the CDC in the past that each CMS number be its own NHSN number? So therefore, facilities that have greater than 400 beds would no longer have greater than 400. And also, wouldn't it cause confusion if people were readmitted to a different building that originally they had their surgery done? Therefore, it would show up in the public reporting as actual readmission to another facility. And was that considered whenever that guidance was generated?
Right. So I think that, when we were doing this risk adjustment for all of our measures, the expectation is that all of the hospitals that were reporting data to us were an individual entity and not a system. We do know there are hospital systems that have, hospitals spread out over maybe a metro area, and the experience in those hospitals are going to be very different. So we really want to push to apply risk adjustment specific to the patients and the experiences in that hospital. I think that question is a good question. It's a little bit out of context for what we're talking today because we can go really in depth to talk about it. But I will say that, our drive and our goal is to make sure that systems are not enrolled in NHSN as one reporting entity. So if you have 3 hospitals, even if you're under the same CCN, you have 3 reporting entities to NHSN so that we can look at facility bed size. And, again, it's going to be interesting to see when we do rebaseline, we can look at those factors. We can look and see, okay, what NHSN facility IDs have maybe been split out there, and we can tell that by their facility bed size. We can start to look at those factors. Question.
Linda from Concord, New Hampshire. Maggie, I want to say thank you for everything for today, for the 2 hours, and yesterday from you and your colleagues. I definitely better understand SIR and p-values and confidence intervals.
Good.
But an observation, there's a low probability that I'll be able to adequately explain to the C-suite and the board.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that feedback, and I can certainly make a note of how you can make an interpretation for that audience. So thank you for that feedback. Okay, next question.
I have a question from a pediatric perspective. So the complex 30-day SSI model, it only has if they're greater than 18 years of age, and
Right.
the ASA and age determines their risk.
Right.
So we are part of a system with the pediatric facility, one CMS number. We report our colon surgeries even though they come out. So if we were to have one infection, it would look like we had 100%. If it's only risk stratified by age and ASA, right? So why is it done that way?
So the reason we had to exclude pediatric patients, I think that was just part of the reporting requirements and the rule built by CMS. So we had to, exclude those patients. Also, pediatric hospitals are excluded from that reporting if they have their own CCN. So I guess that gets at why we use an SIR and not a rate. For that instance. So, if the numbers are so low and you only have one infection, you wouldn't have a rate of 100%. Does that kind of answer your question?
Well, I'm just trying to, why is the risk for just that set is ASA and age? Why are the other risk factors not included to make that SIR in the other SIR sets?
Gotcha. It just goes back to us having to have a harmonized measure and working with our colleagues for something that was considered suitable for that level of public reporting. So, while we have that one model used for public reporting internally, you may wish to use a different model. And, nationally, when we report aggregate data out from CDC, we use that complex AR model that is not limited to a patient's age. Okay. Next question.
So I guess my question is probably going to be a bit of a follow-up on what she just asked. I listened to before when you said that CDC was tasked with coming up with a harmonized measure for CMS that would be NQF endorsed. I'm still not clear because it seems to me that the complex AR measure, SIR, that you come out with is the best measure. Why do they limit it to just ASA and age and 30 days? It sort of gives us two data sets to have to play with at the hospital because we appreciate the logistic regression and the SIRS that you've come out with for the complex ARs, and so that's the data that intuitively I'd like to use at my hospital.
Right.
And yet when it's published in CMS, it's going to look different. And so now not only do I have to explain the whole SIR business to the board, I have to say, well,
why are these different?
Our data is better than what you're seeing. Why is that limited? I don't understand that.
Yeah, and I get your question. I appreciate it. Unfortunately, I personally wasn't part of those discussions, so I can't speak to exactly why. But your feedback is definitely appreciated.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question. I wonder with the C. diff SIR SIRS, at the end of each calendar quarter when the data summary gets checked for the lab type, how soon will those SIRs run? Is it immediate or?
As soon as you generate data sets after entering those data.
Good.
Yep.
Great. Thanks.
Hi,
Yes. Hi.
Kathy from Indiana. One of the hospitals texted me and they want to know where the resource is that tells them how to run the SIR for different time frames other than a calendar year.
Okay, so great question. So on our website, they can go to, actually, I don't even have the link up here. I apologize. They go to the NHSN website and go to the Patient Safety Analysis Resources page. There's a link at the top that says Quick Reference Guides. And they click on that, and at the top of the Quick Reference Guides page, towards the top, there's a section called Frequently Requested Output or Reports, and it will be listed in there.
Okay.
Yep, great question. Okay, well, I thank you all for your time. I think we have a break coming up.